So I've been looking at the class size debate by Peter Blanchford, and it basically talks about the benefits and the cons of having a smaller class. Most of the time, it's just a benefit. I've been in many different settings throughout my educational life, and I've noticed that the smaller the class and the more help you have, the better attainment, the better engagement, and the better understanding you have from your students. My first setting as an NQT was an academy training school. I was a year 3 teacher, and I was a class ratio of 1 to 33. Quite often my TA would be there in the morning, but she wouldn't be there in the afternoon. And more than likely, my TA was not even there in the morning because she would get taken off to another setting. Another class. Quite often as well, I would have other children come down from year 4, year 5 into my maths group, because they were working at a lower level. However, I was never allowed to send any children down to a different year group. I was expected to basically have them catch up, even though they needed to be back down in year 2, because they were struggling in year 2 when they were there anyway. So it very much felt one-sided. I didn't feel very supported. So I just found it very, very challenging. I had to change my writing. I had to change my I had to change my handwriting. I had to make sure all those children were caught up to scratch, even though they weren't ready to be in that environment, which I found really unfair. They were struggling with their sort of 2s and 5 times tables. I had other children doing all their times tables, knew them all up to 12 times 12, and were even going beyond that and doing sort of 12 times 20. And I had to try and get them all at the same level. Everything had to be written down 4 or 5 times. They had to have about 3 targets for each lesson. It was just ridiculous. It was too much pressure, there was too many children for one person. I was an NQT at the time, and I was just felt very unsupported. I had a tutor, like a buddy for my NQT. She was fantastic, but it was just a very archaic way of ruling. We had a head teacher, and if she came into the room, all the children would sort of fall silent, but she would also silently come into the room. So it felt like quite often she was trying to catch you out being a bad teacher, or she was trying to catch you out and that you were doing something that she wouldn't recommend. I remember writing a 7 on the board. Luckily, the children weren't in the classroom at this time, but I wrote a 7 on the board and did a little dash in the middle, like some people do. And she turned around to me and she went, "Miss Rice, we don't do our 7s like that here." And it was just, I felt very micromanaged. And considering we were part of an academy chain, it was very hard to deal with. Being 1 to 33 with a lot of SEN needs was just it was not a great situation, basically. I didn't enjoy it. I found it very challenging, and I actually lost my love for teaching over it. I felt like 1 to 33 was absolutely ridiculous, even though there are classes out there that have got larger amounts of students and larger amounts of and just one teacher. That class needed more support, basically, and every time I asked for it, I was basically told no. When I went on maternity leave, the other teacher came in. She had more teaching experience than me. She asked for certain levels of support, which I had been asked for the entire time, and she got it because she was more experienced, where I was just treated as an NQT. I didn't feel the management there was great at all, and it really put me off teaching for a long time. I went actually back into supply work when I came back out of teaching, and I worked for a different school, which was I was in a 3-form entry. It's usually 2-form, but I was in the inflated year, but it was a mixed inflated year. So all the other year groups were sort of 1, 2, 3, but I had mixed 3-4. So it was sort of a half inflated year because there was 1.5 classes for both year 3 and 1.5 classes for year 4, so they combined them together. It was a very interesting dynamic working in a mixed class. But not only was it 3 form, so we had year 3-4 classes. We had 5 teachers for those year 3-4 classes, and I was part of a partnership. So I would teach on Mondays, Tuesdays, and Fridays, and my partner teacher would teach on Wednesdays and Thursdays. It was a really nice way of doing things because I was able to start and end the. I was able to start and end the week with the children. So it was just a very, very different way of management. It was a very different way of leading things. The head teacher there had a very different aura around her. She just trusted her staff. So when she came into the room, it didn't feel like she was there to catch you out. It was sort of there as a learning walk, as a learning environment. She encouraged you in your sort of PPA time, or she encouraged you and set out times where you could then go and have a look at other people teaching. It was like she was all for that educational purpose. She was all for planning around the children. She was all for teamwork, and we were also part of an academy train as well. So quite often when it came to staff meetings, we might have it in another setting. And we'd be looking at the way that they mark papers, we'd be looking at the way that they lead certain lessons, different ways of analysing data and stuff like that. And it just felt like a community. So it was definitely more post-heroic, the way that they led their team. It was a very nice way of working. And actually, if I was offered a permanent position and not just part of the supply, I would have probably stayed there. Life has turned out slightly differently, so I've actually in a different town now, so that's completely irrelevant anyway. But the big thing about the second school matches this is actually the class size was much smaller. So whereas I was 1 to 33 in the village school, I was 1 to 26 in the other school, in the 3-form entry. And it just made a very big difference. So even though I was still working with the same year group mixed with year 4, it just had such a different environment having those less children. And it was nearly 10 less children some days, depending on some of the some of the class illnesses. But not only that, I found it really interesting that if for whatever reason we didn't have a supply for one of the classes, that class would get mixed into our class or mixed into, I'm going to call her Jane, would get mixed into Jane's class. So Jane was the only teacher that worked full time and had her own class. So let's say one of the teachers were off in Leslie's class. Her class would then join mine and Jane's class. So sometimes we actually ended up with more children, but our TAs were our TAs. We shared 2 TAs among the 3 classes, but they were ours. So on the days where one of the classes was split between the other 2, we still had our own TA. It just added that extra element. So we went from sort of 1 to 30 or 36 to actually 2 to 36, which was split in half, and you'd still be in the teens on your ratios. And our TAs were very highly trained TAs. They were almost HLTAs. They would have quite easily been able to lead the classes. They ran their own interventions. They were just brilliant. They had their own resources. They had their own systems, but they were able to communicate with us effectively, which is a big thing in here. Actually, depending on your class sizes and your help, you need to be able to open up those lines of communication with your other staff. And as I said, that post-heroic way of working actually made me fall in love with education all over again. It was just such a contrast between working in a village school where it was 1 to 33 and you were reprimanded for everything, to actually being taught, well, I would have done it differently. This is how I would have done it. I noticed you did this. Why don't you try it like this next time? So they taught you how to teach rather than reprimanding you for not doing it right. And it was so refreshing, so refreshing. Had I been able to stay in that school, I would have stayed there. Um, Unfortunately, because it was a long-term supply role, I my contract ended, and circumstances led me into working with nurseries. Obviously, being a supply teacher, if you don't work over the holidays, you don't get paid. So I volunteered to, not volunteered, but I said that I would quite happily cover nurseries over the holidays. And that's how I ended up working for a Reggio Emilia based nursery. Again, the management there was quite archaic. We had the owner, she was fantastic, but my manager in my branch was very archaic. You got reprimanded for everything. She wasn't a particularly nice person either. She was about my age. Even the other staff noticed that she treated me differently. My room leader even pulled me aside and said, "I'm so sorry for the way that our manager treats you." It got to the point I had to get HR involved, and I ended up leaving with about 3 months. Unfortunately, she's still there, but I know there is quite a few issues that she's been pulled up on. And this made me think of this book. So this is Peter K. Smith, Understanding the School Bully. But actually, a lot of this book I feel can be related into management style. So this book was released in baby, I'm doing a video at the moment. This book was released in 2014. One of the things on here is a effectiveness of coping strategies. So it's page 143. One thing I found particularly interesting in this book was evidence suggests that fighting back is not a successful strategy. I also found it interesting to say that bullying is more persistent for 5 to 6 year old male victims who fought back. I actually don't know if I fully agree with that, for experience of myself. Working in primary schools and working in nurseries, out of girls and boys, I'd say, yeah, boys are a little bit more boisterous and they do have a tendency to rally each other up a little bit more. However, I don't necessarily agree with 5 to 6 year old boys being main targets of bullying. I'd love to see where they got their references from. I do, however, agree with the evidence that they interviewed 13 to 60-year-old pupils in England with peer support systems, and they found that five most frequent coping strategies were talking to someone, followed by ignoring it, sticking up for yourself, and avoiding bullies, and making more/different friends. However, I feel like this is easier said than done. So, understanding school bullying. I find that these are good coping mechanisms, but they don't necessarily deal with the problem. So, when I was at the first nursery setting I worked in, I stood up for myself by talking to HR. Nothing happened. I made friends with the staff there. Nothing happened. Nothing changed, and I used my. I tried avoiding her completely at one point, and again that made things worse. So I don't necessarily think that this helps those that are struggling with it in a very smaller setting. This seems to be in a much larger setting. They actually conducted a study as well. So for like older people in their school career, Swedish students, all 18 years old, who'd been bullied in their school career, they asked them what made the bullying stop, if it did, and analysed the results. 25% said school personnel, 23 transition to new school level, and 20% change coping strategies, 12 support from parents, 12 change of appearance and well-being, 11 change of school or class, 11 making new friends, 8 the bullies change their attitude, 5 no particular reason, 4 support from peers, and 3 other reasons. I found the biggest one, obviously they're saying is 25, is the support from school personnel. Now, I believe I did have support from HR, but because it was my manager and she was the manager of that branch and she had a clique of friends, quite two of them largely based in the room that I was based in, um, I don't feel that actually I did get that supported in what was happening. So even though my room leader was aware of the situation, was aware that the manager wasn't treating me particularly well, wasn't treating other staff members particularly well. She had a clique of friends that she would bend the rules for, and quite often, even though I did 4 full days, I didn't work on a Friday, but I did four 8 till 6s. I wasn't even supposed to be based in that setting. I was supposed to be based 8 till 6 in a setting 10 minutes closer to my home, 15 minutes closer to my home. Um, they knew what my timetable was. My daughter started preschool at 7:30 in the morning. It was a half an hour journey with very little traffic, and they still put me in at 8 o'clock, but that was my fault. Of course. So they changed my hours to quarter past till quarter past. So I was quarter past 8 till quarter past 6. But yeah, it was still my fault that they had put me in that setting. It was my fault that I was always late the first time they arrived, even though I specifically said to them, oh, it's a half an hour journey from my daughter's setting to here. And they still expected me to arrive 10 minutes early before my shift. So they were expecting me to do a half an hour journey in 20 minutes. It was just not possible. But again, it was that very archaic ruling. Every time I came in late, even though I said to them, I was like, look, it takes half an hour for me to get here. My daughter's setting is literally opens the door at 7:30. I cannot get here any earlier than I'm getting here, basically. They were like, well, you're getting marked for it. You're getting a note on your file for it. So I ended up with loads of notes, and a lot of it wasn't even my fault. And or if it was my fault, then I would accept it. But again, I wasn't being taught anything. I just sort of rocked up to this new setting. There was another girl with me. She was trained, coming in to be an apprentice. They treated her even worse than they treated me. We were basically told that I was going to be outside lead, and she was going to be coming outside with me as well. She had her own health problems, so she actually made it quite clear that when the temperature gets really low, she would struggle being outside all the time. They just ignored it. She was just outside with me all the time. There were times I was a 1 to 13 ratio due to my QTS. I had 1 to 13. They used that on a daily basis, but not only did they use the 1 to 13 ratio, there were times there would be 3 members of staff inside, me outside with 20 children by myself. Now I'm used to 1 to 33 children. I'm used to 1 to 26 children, but in ratio law, obviously, if I'm 1 to 13, I'm supposed to be 1 to 13. But they would say it was a holistic ratio because they'd have the door open. But there'd only be about 8 children inside the building. 3 members of staff in with those 8 children. I'll be outside with the rest of them. And again, I would be reprimanded, even though it was an L-shaped garden. I'd be reprimanded if I'm having to deal with an incident in one area and I couldn't see around the corner. But anytime I radioed through for help, it was basically ignored, or I was told to just deal with it. So I wasn't there for very long because I found it a very horrible way of managing a business, and it had a very high turnover of staff, and the manager was complained about a lot. Actually, I'd worked in different settings across that chain, and the managing style there was completely different. So I actually went into one of their other forestry settings, and they couldn't have been any more helpful. They answered all of my questions. I didn't feel like I was just a nuisance, and that wasn't even the setting that I was supposed to be based in. It was a completely different setting, to the point they trusted me enough to drive the minibus for the first time with a truckload of children, and I was comfortable doing that because they had that faith in me. Anytime I suggested something in the other setting, it was no, no, we're not doing that. No, you just don't understand what you're doing. No, we're not doing that. And when it came to like provocations and stuff like this, I was never fully explained how to start them. I was never taught that process. So I'd start doing activities out in the garden, and they'd be like, well, that's not what you're supposed to be doing. You're supposed to be doing this. This doesn't lead on from this. And it was, again, I was just reprimanded. And that's not the best way to get through to me. I don't learn that way. Constructive criticism I can take on and I can learn from. However, this was, no, you're doing it wrong. But they weren't telling me what I was doing wrong. They were just telling me I was doing it wrong, and then I'd get reprimanded for it. So again, it was very archaic. I moved on from that setting. and went into the one that my daughter was in. The manager there was very different again. I ended up being in a more senior leadership role, and I really, really enjoyed it there. It was still quite an archaic way of working. The manager had been there for about 12, 13 years, but due to my leadership style, we were sort of a yin and yang. So she was very much, Charlie, can you go and do this? Charlie, can you go and do that? But she didn't do it in a horrible way, like, you need to go and do this and you need to go and do it now. Like, she wouldn't shout at me or anything like that. She would just sort of have a conversation with me. And then because of my management style being a little bit more open and a bit more opposed to heroic, I like to get that initiation from all the staff before a final decision is made. I like to try and get everybody's ideas together and mesh them into something that we can all use to our advantage. So that leadership style worked in the fact that I tended to be a lot more post-heroic and take the more archaic ideas from the other teachers and from the other senior management, and sort of filter it down to staff in a way that we all had an inclusive environment. So unfortunately, I've left that setting now due to going on maternity leave and needing a different sort of role. But I just found it very interesting in terms of understanding the school bully, that actually strategies and communication, again, much like in the classroom debate, was just being open and honest and talking to each other is a big part of dealing with situations. Now, I know in understanding school bully that wasn't as high as other ones, but it wasn't always possible just to keep changing settings. When you get older and older and older, you can't just keep changing jobs because it doesn't create that stability, and you'll never be able to learn necessarily from the situation. I suppose you could keep changing jobs, but it just wasn't an option for me at the time. I couldn't just keep changing jobs. I had to sort of find another job before I left a job. Yeah, but again, it was just a very different way of working. Even though the class sizes, again, were slightly bigger because we could have over 40 odd children in the preschool room in the next setting. We also had a lot more teachers. So my 1:13 ratio was used, but we had a lot more space for them. So there would be 33 children in the room, but we had 3 rooms and an outdoor area that they could all be stretched upon. My daughter still attends the setting now, and they're doing really, really well there. They've changed it to the curiosity approach, and that whole leadership style was also mentioned in that changeover to the leadership. Changeover in leadership for the curiosity approach. It becomes much more inclusive and takes on board class management. It also got me thinking about teaching through play, because obviously the last setting has changed over to the curiosity approach, and before we were just a very classic setting. A big part of this was teachers don't often get time to just observe their class and the way that they play and the way that they learn. And actually, it's a really integral part of understanding the curriculum and understanding how to move forward with your child, with your group. I find it interesting that they have a whole section about management and organisation, because I don't think enough is done in any primary setting or any school setting just to allow children to be children. And it does worry me because my daughter is going to school in September. I just find that the curriculum is still quite constrained. The EYFS curriculum has changed massively, so it actually works with the eye of the child and planning through the child, and rather than just age expected expectations, it sort of is more of a natural flow. This is what they should be achieving, blah blah blah, what they should be working towards, and it's just a nice way of doing things. Like, they're letting children be children, they're letting children learn through play, and actually that just kind of stops a bit more. So they start in reception, which is still very much like preschool, a little bit with some more structured interventions throughout the day, but as they go through education, that element of creativity and play and those pockets of curiosity are just filtered away. And when it gets to secondary school, you have to sort of regain and relearn all those skills. I remember speaking to one of the other students previously about their way that their school was run, and it was secondary, and how they have like student councils and stuff like this, and then it's great because it promotes collaboration, and how it expands their teaching and learning through talking to each other. But what I found really interesting is that yes, the secondary school did have a school council, it did have this collaborative space where children could talk to each other and learn from each other, and that reciprocal learning. However, examinations are still, that is your seat, that is where you'll sit. You will not talk to anybody, you will not have any of your notes. Everything you've done across the board is down to this final thing, and it just completely throws me off because we're telling children, oh, you need to be cooperative, you need to be able to work in a team, you need to be understanding to other people's feelings, you need to be collaborative, you need to be initiate, you need to be creative, you've got to be this, that, blah, 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 blah. But when it comes down to your grade, it's down to you. That's it. No one else. It's you, it's that chair, it's that pencil, done. And that's it. You get one shot, you blow it, you're you're through basically. But everything around that exam is still, well, speak to your neighbour, talk to your partner, what do they know? Write it down. And it's just, it doesn't link up. It's like this whole missing link. Like everything you've done beforehand is collaborative, and then it comes to the exam and it's like, nope, this is down to you now. You have to remember everything that you've worked on with this team, even though your strength might not be part of this exam, and your strength might be one of your leaders and the other ones, actually you just got to do this by yourself. And I found it really bizarre. Um, and that's why I think that this is actually really important across all of the boards. So this is by Neville Bennett and Liz Wood and Sue Rogers. It's called Teaching Through Play. It's published by the Open University Press. It was reprinted in 2008 in Minehead, Berkshire. But I actually feel like it says here, so the practice of rotating play in a formal activity is militated against teachers being involved in play for sustained periods, since their attention was most often focused on formal tasks with small groups, where play appeared to fulfill teachers' intentions, and where children were described as engrossed and focused. Teachers were generally available to observe and participate. Now, in the current setting I work at, I'm the deputy manager of a preschool in a chain setting. I really love my role. I'm a room-based deputy manager. It's a very small team, but we have maximum of 24 children, and there's only 5 of us in the whole team in my setting. We have just hired an apprentice, which will only be working 2 days a week for a little while. But again, we're a very small team, and it's very rare that all 5 of us are actually in one day. Quite often it's just 4 of us. Or sometimes it's 3 of us, depending. Again, I'm 1 to 13, so our ratios are still covered. But a lot of it is about just observing the children. So sometimes you feel like a bit of a loose part, but anything that I do in that setting, I will speak to the manager, and I will speak to the staff, and I will speak to the children before a final decision is made. Yes, I have the ultimate decision. Yes, when it comes to dealing with parents at the door and difficult situation, it would be me if our manager is. Hi! Is I am definitely much more post-heroic in the way that I teach, and the way that I teach how to teach, in the way that I lead. I think it is a much more sustainable way of leadership. Just have that open and honest communication with your staff, I think, is really important. Um, and yes, we have got higher up. So we've got our CEO, we've got our next to our CEO, we've got she used to be an Ofsted inspector, so obviously she comes in hot. The actual nursery is rated outstanding, so we've got very high expectations within our setting. And we also have the operations manager, so obviously she operates the management of all of the nurseries and decides who's going where. But a big rule is that there always has to be a manager on site, basically. Um, if they're the only day and they even get a manager from a different setting on Fridays, because I don't currently work on Fridays and neither does our current manager, but they will get a manager from another site or a higher member of staff to be there. They don't just leave it to the staff members. It's not due to trust, but it's due to covering our own backs. Our staff is very experienced, and it's one thing here that I think is sometimes overlooked in learning through play. Um, is that trust. So I don't micromanage my team at all. I just trust them. And I will have a look around at what they're doing, obviously, and make recommendations. We will have a look at certain things that they're putting out. We've got some quite severe allergies. So I will have a look and I will ask them to double check with either me or Emily before going out of their way, sort of thing. But in general, it is very post-heroic. We do have that open communication, which is mentioned previously, and it is just very important for us to trust our team because we are such a small setting. It is just important for us to know that we've got each other's back, basically, and that we're doing the best that we can for our children. Um, and this is what made me think of Nick Luxmore's essential listening skills for a busy school and staff. What to say when you don't know what to say. This is basically a guide made for busy schools. It was published by Jessica Kingsley in London in where is it? 2015. And what I find really lovely is right at the back, well, not even right at the back, right in the middle, it says how to talk to people who lack self-esteem. And I think this is not touched upon enough in leadership. Actually, yes, some of the staff that we hire are competent enough to do their role, or they wouldn't have been hired. But actually, they lack a lot of self-esteem on their, and that can affect the quality of work that they produce because they don't believe in themselves enough. So you've obviously seen the potential in them, but yeah, they're struggling to necessarily show it. But this whole book basically explains how to talk to people with low self-esteem. One of the things that I discussed in my last summative assessment was inflated praise. So some leadership styles are all about, oh, well done, team, that's incredible, you've done a super good job today, woo! But actually, some people don't respond to that as well. So if you say to them, oh, you've done a really super amazing job, it actually stresses them out. Because you've set such high expectations of them to produce that sort of work every time they do it, they end up sort of micromanaging themselves. And they always find that their work is never good enough for themselves. They become really critical of their own thinking and their own pedagogy. But this just sort of brings back how to talk to them in a way that you'll be able to produce effective work and effective uh, ways for them not to internalize. Maybe I'll get your book in a minute. Not to internalize how they're feeling. Basically, to talk a little bit more to them. And a big thing at the back is self-esteem comes from feeling understandable to another person. When we get on, we feel good, and when we get on all the time, we feel great. So I have a dream team. I love my team. We get on really well all the time. At the moment, obviously, and it's just having that helping someone with low self-esteem, just being that person to support them in a way that they need. So like remembering names is really important. Recognizing them for their value of work, encouraging them rather than just sort of surplus compliments, encouraging them, teaching them as well, I think is really important. Um, I was a bartender for many years, and the next is how to talk to somebody who's angry, and I found that really helpful as well. So this is really good for those that are just starting in management and are struggling to open up with certain conversations. I actually got it for my last role, in my last summative assessment, to be able to help with this course as well. But it's like a manual and a guide for how to talk to your staff and create a really positive environment for learning. Moving on, a big one here is if your staff are feeling happy and your children are happy in the environment, it should create a calming, peaceful environment. And I was looking at this lovely book, which is Guiding the Behaviour of Children and Young People, Linking Theory and Practice 0 to 8 Years by Jenny Linden. It was published by Hood Education in 2008. A big thing here is again about social relationships. A big thing here about problem solving and conflict resolution as well. If you don't feel your best, you're not going to work your best. If you don't feel confident and happy, you're not going to be confident and happy in your environment. And if you don't get on with the people that you work with, it's going to make life very challenging quite often. And this is the basis. I'm just going to the page 118. I did have this pre-prepared. However, I dropped the book earlier and now I've lost the page. So just bear with me. 118. So problem solving. Problem solving isn't just about disrupting relationships and bullying and conflict resolution. Problem solving is also about team building as well. So one of the things here that I really enjoyed reading was on page 119. What is the best idea? And it says decide on the best solution out of those discussed, talk through the possible options, how will the solution work, what would we need to be prepared to do to make it work well, and what's on our side to make it work. What might get us halfway to the solution, and how can we deal with other possible blocks. I thought this was really, really, really valid advice for leadership and management, especially in post-heroic leadership and management, where it's not just one independent person. I found this really interesting as a baseline for all meetings in education, not just with staff, but also with children. This is the way I like to work. So it's basically reflecting on your pedagogy and trying to build upon it in a really positive way. So obviously looking at the problem, what's caused the problem, how will you resolve the problem, where do you go moving forward, what could possibly get in the way next, and just safeguarding yourself along the way as well. I just found this whole chapter really interesting and insightful. Because it's not just the behaviour that's necessarily going to be an issue. I feel that behaviour and engagement do go hand in hand. So if the children are not engaged in what you're doing because you've planned it around what you want rather than what they want, it's going to be much harder to control the environment. And that's something I was trying to touch upon when it comes to roles of play in secondary school and primary school, is that actually it's kind of taught out of us to explore and be curious. It's really, for me, I find it really challenging when I now walk into a primary setting and I'm told this is the curriculum, this is what we have to teach them, this is the week you've got to do it, next week we're moving on whether they've got it or not, basically. And I felt like I was never able just to sort of put things on the side for them and say, look, this once you've finished, go and have a gander, see if you can figure this out. Like, here's a problem, try and solve it, work together, because it was always about passing examinations. And at the end of the day, this is what my really big issue is with education and leadership and management, is there's all these different styles, from archaic to post-heroic to schools with absolutely no head teacher, like the ones down in Devon, that have just completely student run, council run, teacher run. There's free schools, there's academies, but at the end of the day, the majority of the schools across our UK education system is still based on passing examinations. Now, there are certain schools like Atelier 21 in Sussex that are alternative based, but again, they still do formative GCSEs, so they'll still come out with an academic grade at the end of their learning experience, even though they've been taught in a different way. There's High Tech High in America that have completely scrapped a lot of examinations, which I find really interesting as well. Looking into that school, they are an alternative based setting. 1 second. High Tech High do a expose. A lot of the schools, there's a few chain settings here called Little Barn Owls. They'll also do exposes. Montessori Academy in which is a preschool / nursery, will also do sort of tours of parents leading up to what it is they've been learning. So it's like a gallery almost. And it's a really beautiful way of doing things. And it showcases, it's basically a showcase of the children's ideas, how hard they've worked. And yeah, it's just a beautiful way of learning. And they aren't using examinations. So a big thing as part of all this leadership and management is you can do whatever style you want. But at the moment in current education, until our whole outcome changes, where we're doing all these different styles and we're motivating the children differently, and we're doing all these different ways of engagement, but we're still ending up preparing them for examinations. And that is what I'm finding the hardest thing to comprehend at the moment, is there are so many different ways to do things, but ultimately the same aim across a lot of the educational settings is to get the grade. And that's a very independent thing for the child to do. So teaching all these skills and preparing all these students, and yes, I agree, I'd much rather work in a happier, cooperative, engaging environment than one that's being dictated and reprimanded constantly, because I'd rather get the grade out of enjoyment than out of fear. But it's still ultimately the same goal, is get the grade. So I'm just going to leave you with that, basically. I've looked at some really lovely theorists, and a big part of this book here, Brilliant Primary Teacher, is about being open and honest with your staff and your teachers. It was published in 2015, and it's by Andy Cope and Stuart Spenlow. A big part of this basically teaches teachers to think outside the box and to put the children at the forefront of everything they do. And if you're stuck, ask for help and use this book to help you as well. Don't feel like we have to constantly follow rules on what should be done. Work a bit on instinct and know your children, and just make sure that you're being open and honest with the SLT. Understand your children, basically. Understand what they need, understand where they've come from, learn their cultural capital, and reflect on your pedagogy. And when it comes to leadership and management, be kind, be understanding, be gentle. Don't make them learn in fear. Make them learn in fun. So I'm just going to leave you with that, basically. That I believe that we should be encouraging and supporting and embracing children. But still, our ultimate goal across many of our educational settings that are government funded is pass the test, pass it well, remember the facts, write them down. So, something I'm really fighting to change. That's why I'm in UIFS at the moment, because I find it so much more free in the curriculum. But yeah, so that's my well done for staying this far. That's my view on different settings and the way that they've been run, and a couple of the theories we've touched upon, and my own personal experience. So thank you for watching. Sorry about the kids running around in the background. It's been a hard week, but love to you all, and speak soon. Bye.